Eleanor Grayson sat in her favorite armchair, the one with the faded green upholstery that had cradled her through decades of life's highs and lows. At 72, her hands bore the delicate lines of time, but her eyes still sparkled with the resilience of youth. The living room smelled of lavender and old books, a sanctuary of memories where she'd raised her son, Thomas, and weathered the storms of widowhood. Tonight, though, the air felt charged, like the moment before a summer storm. Thomas and his wife, Lily, were coming over for dinner, and their cryptic phone call earlier had hinted at big news. The doorbell chimed, pulling Eleanor from her thoughts. She smoothed her cardigan and opened the door to find Thomas, his broad shoulders filling the frame, and Lily, radiant with a nervous smile. At 35, Thomas had his father's strong jaw and Eleanor's quiet intensity. Lily, a few years younger, glowed with an energy that seemed to hum beneath her skin. They hugged Eleanor tightly, their excitement palpable, and she ushered them into the dining room where a modest spread of roast chicken and vegetables waited. "Mom, we've got something to tell you," Thomas said, his voice steady but edged with anticipation. He reached for Lily's hand, and Eleanor's heart quickened. She'd seen that look before when Thomas announced his engagement, when he landed his first big job. But this felt different, heavier. Lily's eyes glistened as she spoke. "We're pregnant. I'm due in 6 months." The words hung in the air, bright and fragile, like a soap bubble catching the light. Eleanor's breath caught. A grandchild. The thought bloomed in her chest, warm and overwhelming. She stood, tears pricking her eyes, and enveloped them both in a hug, her laughter mingling with theirs. "Oh, my dears, that's wonderful," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "A baby. My goodness, a baby." She pictured tiny hands, soft coos, the kind of love that rewrote your heart. She'd been alone since her husband, George, passed 10 years ago, and though she filled her days with gardening and book club, this news felt like a new chapter, a gift she hadn't dared hope for. They sat back down, the candlelight flickering across their faces. Eleanor was already imagining knitting booties, reading bedtime stories, and maybe even teaching the little one to plant tulips in the spring. But then Thomas cleared his throat, his expression shifting to something more serious, almost hesitant. "There's something else, Mom," he said, glancing at Lily, who nodded encouragingly. "Lily's getting a big promotion at work. It's a huge opportunity, but it means longer hours, travel, the works. And my job's not slowing down either. We've been talking, and we'd like you to watch the baby. Full-time." The words landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples through Eleanor's joy. "Full-time." She blinked, her smile faltering. "Full-time," she repeated, her voice softer than she intended. "You mean, like daycare?" "More than that," Lily said quickly, her tone gentle but firm. "We'd need you to be the primary caregiver while we're at work. It'd be 5 days a week, maybe some evenings. We know it's a lot to ask, but you're so good with kids, and we trust you completely." Eleanor's hands tightened around her napkin. She loved Thomas and Lily, and the idea of being close to her grandchild thrilled her. But full-time caregiving? At her age, she'd raised Thomas single-handedly after George's death, pouring every ounce of herself into motherhood. She'd loved it, but it had left her drained. Her own dream-soft painting, of traveling, of simply being Eleanor pushed to the margins. She'd only just begun to rediscover herself, to savor the quiet freedom of her days. I don't know what to say," she managed, her mind racing. "It's a big responsibility." Her voice trembled slightly, and she hated how fragile it sounded. Thomas's brow furrowed, and Lily's smile wavered, as if they hadn't expected hesitation. "We thought you'd be excited," Thomas said, a hint of disappointment in his tone. "You always said you loved being a mom. And you're alone now, so we figured it'd give you purpose." The word alone stung, sharp and cold. Eleanor forced a smile, but inside, she felt a tug-of-war between love and self-preservation. She wanted to be there for her family, to be the grandmother who baked cookies and sang lullabies. But she also wanted to protect the fragile peace she'd carved out for herself. The mornings spent sketching by the window, the evenings lost in novels. Could she do both? Did she have a choice? "I am excited," she said carefully, "but I need time to think about it. It's a lot to take on." Thomas and Lily exchanged a glance, and Eleanor sensed their surprise, maybe even a touch of frustration. They'd assumed she'd say yes without question, that her life was an open book waiting for their story to fill it. The rest of the dinner passed in a blur of small talk and forced smiles. Eleanor asked about baby names and due dates, but her mind kept circling back to Thomas's words, full time. When they left, she stood at the door, watching their car disappear into the night, her heart heavy with love and uncertainty. Back in her armchair, Eleanor stared at the photo of George on the mantel. "What would you do, love?" she whispered. George had always been the dreamer, the one who urged her to paint, to explore, to live for herself. But he was gone, and this decision was hers alone. She thought of the baby, a tiny life she already loved, and the weight of what her son was asking. Could she say no without breaking their bond? Could she say yes without losing herself? The night stretched on, and Eleanor didn't sleep. Her mind churned with memories of raising Thomas, sleepless nights, endless diapers, the joy and exhaustion woven so tightly together. She'd given everything then, but she was younger, stronger. Now, at 72, her body ached in the mornings, and her energy wasn't what it used to be. Yet the thought of her grandchild filled her with a warmth she hadn't felt in years. She imagined holding that tiny bundle, singing the lullabies her mother had sung to her. But full-time, 5 days a week, maybe more. The idea loomed like a mountain she wasn't sure she could climb. By dawn, Eleanor was no closer to an answer. She brewed a pot of tea and sat by the window, watching the first light touch her garden. The tulips she'd planted last spring were just starting to fade, their petals curling inward like secrets. She wondered if this was what her life would become, curling inward, defined by someone else's needs. Or maybe, just maybe, there was a way to balance it all. To be the grandmother she wanted to be without losing the woman she was still becoming. The days following Thomas and Lily's announcement blurred into a haze of introspection for Eleanor. She went through her routines, watering the garden, attending book club, sketching in her notebook, but her thoughts were elsewhere, tangled in the question of what her life would become if she said yes. She loved her son fiercely, and the idea of being a central figure in her grandchild's life filled her with a quiet joy. But the weight of full-time pressed against her, a reminder of the years she'd spent putting her own desires on hold. One morning, as she sipped her tea and flipped through an old photo album, Eleanor lingered on a picture of herself at 40, holding a toddler Thomas in her arms. Her smile was bright but tired, her eyes carrying the strain of single motherhood. She'd been so consumed by raising him that she'd let go of her dream to paint, to travel, to explore the world beyond their small town. George's death had forced her to be practical, to prioritize stability over passion. Now, with Thomas grown and her life finally her own, she'd begun to reclaim those lost pieces. Her sketchbook was filled with half-finished drawings, landscapes, faces, moments she wanted to capture. Could she set that aside again? She decided to visit her friend Margaret, a sprightly 80-year-old who lived across town. Margaret's house was a riot of color, with vibrant quilts draped over every surface and a garden that rivaled Eden. Over cups of chamomile tea, Eleanor poured out her dilemma. "They want me to be the baby's full-time caregiver," she said, her voice low. "I love them, but I'm not sure I can do it. Not like that." Margaret leaned back, her eyes sharp with understanding. "You've already raised one child, Eleanor. You did it well, but it cost you. What's your heart telling you now?" Eleanor hesitated. "I want to be there for the baby. I do. But I'm afraid. Afraid I'll lose myself again, like I did when Thomas was young. I'm not as strong as I used to be." Margaret nodded, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. "You're stronger than you think. But strength isn't just about saying yes. It's about knowing when to set boundaries. You can love that baby without giving up your life." The words stayed with Eleanor as she drove home, the autumn leaves swirling across the road like scattered thoughts. Boundaries. She'd never been good at setting them. Not with Thomas. Not with anyone. She'd always been the one to give, to sacrifice, to make things work. But maybe Margaret was right. Maybe there was a middle ground. A way to be a grandmother without becoming only a caregiver. That evening, Thomas called to check in. "Have you thought about it, Mom?" he asked, his tone hopeful but tinged with impatience. "We're starting to plan, and we need to know." Eleanor took a deep breath, her fingers tightening around the phone. "I'm still thinking, Thomas. It's a big decision. I want to be part of the baby's life, but I need to figure out what I can handle. Can we talk about it more in person?" There was a pause, and she could almost see Thomas's frown. "Sure, Mom. We'll come by this weekend." His voice was polite, but she sensed his frustration, the unspoken assumption that she'd simply agree. It stung, but it also strengthened her resolve to find her voice. Over the next few days, Eleanor began to research. She read articles about grandparents as caregivers, joined an online forum for older women, and even called a local community center to ask about senior activities. She learned that many grandparents faced similar dilemmas, torn between love for their families and the need to protect their own well-being. One woman's post struck her. "I said yes to full-time care, and I love my grandkids, but I wish I'd negotiated part-time. I miss my own life." The idea of negotiation sparked something in Eleanor. She'd never thought of her role as something she could shape, rather than simply accept or reject. Maybe she could offer to watch the baby a few days a week, or for shorter hours, leaving time for her own pursuits. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. Thrilling because it gave her agency. Terrifying because it meant confronting Thomas and Lily's expectations. On Saturday, they arrived for lunch, bringing a small ultrasound photo that made Eleanor's heart leap. The grainy image showed a tiny form, a miracle in black and white. They sat in the living room, and Eleanor steeled herself. "I've been thinking about your request," she began, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. "I want to be there for the baby, more than anything. But full-time is a lot for me. I'm not as young as I was, and I've got my own life now, me art, my garden, my friends. I'd like to talk about something part-time, maybe 3 days a week." Thomas's face tightened, and Lily's smile faltered. "3 days," Thomas said, his tone sharp. "Mom, we're counting on you. Daycare's expensive, and we don't trust anyone else like we trust you." The words hit hard, stirring guilt and defensiveness. Eleanor wanted to cave, to say yes just to see them smile again. But she thought of Margaret's words. of the woman in the forum, of her own sketchbook lying open on the table. "I understand," she said gently, "but I need to take care of myself too. I can't be everything for the baby if I'm worn out. Let's find a way that works for all of us." Lily's expression softened, but Thomas stood, pacing the room. "This is a lot to process. Mom, we thought you'd be all in." His words carried a trace of hurt, and Eleanor felt the familiar pull to smooth things over. But she held her ground, her heart pounding. "I am all in," she said, her voice firm. "I'm all in for being a grandmother, for loving that baby with everything I have. But I need to be me, too. Can we at least try to figure this out together?" The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling over them. Lily reached for Thomas's hand, her eyes meeting Eleanor's with a flicker of understanding. "Maybe we can look at other options," Lily said softly. "Part-time with you. Part-time with a sitter. We want you to be part of this." Eleanor nodded, relief mingling with uncertainty. It wasn't a solution yet, but it was a start. For the first time, she felt like she was part of the conversation, not just a role to be filled. As they left, she hugged them both, holding on a little longer, her heart full of hope and fear for the road ahead. The weeks that followed were a delicate dance of negotiations and emotions. Eleanor met Thomas and Lily several times to discuss the baby's care. Each conversation a mix of tension and tentative progress. Thomas remained frustrated, his vision of a perfect family plan disrupted. But Lily seemed more open, suggesting compromises like splitting care with a part-time nanny or exploring daycare options. Eleanor appreciated Lily's willingness to listen, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Thomas saw her hesitation as a betrayal. One afternoon, while pruning her roses, Eleanor reflected on her own mother, Clara, who'd been a distant grandmother, more interested in bridge games than babysitting. Clara had loved Eleanor in her own way, but her boundaries had been ironclad, leaving Eleanor to navigate motherhood largely alone after George's death. She'd vowed to be different, present, loving, involved, but now she wondered if Clara's distance had been less about indifference and more about self-preservation. Eleanor decided to take a proactive step. She enrolled in a grandparenting workshop at the community center, hoping to gain insight into her new role. The sessions were led by a warm, no-nonsense woman named Susan, who emphasized the importance of balance. "You're not just a caregiver," Susan said to the group of silver-haired attendees. "You're a person with your own needs. Set limits early, or you'll burn out." Inspired, Eleanor began to outline a proposal for Thomas and Lily. She'd care for the baby 3 days a week, from morning to early afternoon, leaving her evenings and other days free for her art and social life. She'd also help with occasional evenings if they needed a date night. But she'd need clear boundaries, no last-minute requests. No assumptions that she was always available. Writing it down felt empowering, like reclaiming a piece of herself she'd almost given away. When she presented the plan at their next meeting, Thomas's reaction was predictably cool. "3 days isn't enough, Mom," he said, rubbing his temples. "We're trying to build our careers. We need reliability." Lily, however, leaned forward, her eyes thoughtful. "I think it's a good start, Thomas. We can afford a part-time sitter for the other days. And Eleanor's right, she can't do everything. We need to respect that." The discussion stretched into the evening, and though Thomas remained skeptical, they agreed to a trial run, 3 days with Eleanor, 2 with a sitter they'd hire. Eleanor felt a flicker of hope, but also a nagging fear that Thomas's disappointment would linger, straining their bond. As Lily's pregnancy progressed, Eleanor found herself drawn into the excitement despite the tension. She helped Lily pick out nursery colors, sewed a small quilt for the crib, and even sketched a portrait of the ultrasound image, which made Lily tear up. These moments reminded Eleanor of the joy she'd felt raising Thomas. But they also highlighted how different this role could be, less all-consuming, more collaborative. One evening, while sorting through old boxes in the attic, Eleanor found a journal she'd kept during Thomas's early years. The pages were filled with love, but also exhaustion, with entries about missed opportunities and unspoken dreams. One line stood out: "I love him more than life, but sometimes I wonder who I'd be if I had more time for me." The words hit her like a revelation. She'd been so focused on being a good mother that she'd buried her own identity. She didn't want that for her grandmother years. Determined to hold her ground, Eleanor began to prioritize her own life more deliberately. She joined a painting class, her first in decades, and found herself lost in the sweep of colors across the canvas. Each stroke felt like a small act of defiance, a reminder that she was more than a caregiver. She also started walking with Margaret every morning, their conversations a lifeline of laughter and wisdom. When the trial period began, Eleanor was nervous but prepared. The first day, she welcomed the baby's arrival with a mix of excitement and apprehension. Though the baby wasn't born yet, she practiced her routine, setting up a play area, planning naps, imagining how she'd balance care with her own schedule. She felt a quiet confidence growing, a belief that she could do this on her terms. But Thomas's attitude remained a hurdle. He called often, checking in with a tone that bordered on critical, as if waiting for her to falter. One evening, after a particularly terse conversation, Eleanor felt a surge of frustration. She loved her son, but his expectations were suffocating. She decided it was time for a heart-to-heart, not just about the baby, but about their relationship. She invited Thomas over alone, and they sat in the kitchen, the same table where she'd helped him with homework decades ago. "Thomas," she began, her voice steady, "I need you to understand something. I love you, and I love this baby already. But I'm not just a resource for you to use. I'm your mother, and I'm a person with my own life. I want to help, but I can't be everything you want me to be." Thomas looked stunned, his eyes searching hers. "I didn't mean to make you feel like that, Mom," he said quietly. I thought you'd want this as much as we do." "I do," she said, reaching for his hand. "But I need you to see me, not just as Grandma, but as me. Can you do that?" For the first time, Thomas seemed to really hear her. He nodded, his expression softening, and Eleanor felt a weight lift. It wasn't perfect, but it was a progressive step toward a relationship built on mutual respect, not just obligation. As Lily's due date approached, Eleanor's life settled into a new rhythm. She prepared for her role as part-time grandmother with a mix of anticipation and caution, setting up a cozy corner of her home with a crib, soft blankets, and a rocking chair she'd found at a flea market. Her painting class became a weekly highlight, where she'd lose herself in bold strokes of color, each canvas a small victory of self-expression. She felt like she was weaving together two versions of herself, the devoted family woman and the artist she'd always wanted to be. Thomas, though still adjusting to the boundaries Eleanor had set, began to soften. He stopped by one afternoon with a small gift set of watercolor paints, a gesture that felt like an olive branch. "I saw these and thought of you," he said, a shy smile breaking through. Eleanor's heart swelled. It was the first time in months he'd acknowledged her passion for art. She hugged him tightly, sensing a shift, however small, in their dynamic. Lily gave birth to a healthy girl, Ava, on a crisp spring morning. Eleanor was at the hospital, her hands clasped tightly as she waited for news. When Thomas emerged, his face alight with joy and exhaustion, he led her to Lily's room. where Ava lay cradled in her mother's arms. The baby was tiny, with a tuft of dark hair and eyes that seemed to hold the world's secrets. Eleanor's breath caught as she held Ava for the first time, her heart expanding with a love so fierce it almost hurt. The first weeks of Ava's life were a whirlwind. Eleanor began her 3-day schedule, welcoming Ava into her home with a mix of delight and nerves. The baby's cries were sharper than she remembered from Thomas's infancy, but so were the moments of quiet, when Ava's tiny fingers curled around hers. Eleanor sang old lullabies, rocked Ava to sleep, and found herself sketching the baby's face during nap times, capturing the curve of her cheeks in soft pencil lines. But the demands were real. Even 3 days a week tested Eleanor's energy. Her knees ached from bending to the crib, and her painting time shrank as she adjusted to Ava's unpredictable schedule. One afternoon, after a particularly fussy day, Eleanor sat in her armchair, exhausted, wondering if she'd taken on too much. She thought of Susan's words from the workshop: balance isn't perfect. It's about adjusting as you go. She decided to tweak her approach. She hired a local teenager to help with light chores on caregiving days, freeing up moments to rest or sketch. She also started taking Ava for short walks in the stroller, the fresh air reviving them both. These small changes made a difference. But Eleanor knew she'd need to keep communicating with Thomas and Lily to make it work long-term. One evening, Thomas stopped by unexpectedly, his face etched with worry. "Mom, I need to talk," he said, sitting across from her. "Lily's promotion is going better than expected, but it's intense. And my work's picking up too. We're struggling to find a sitter for the other days. I know you said 3 days, but could you do more?" Eleanor's stomach tightened. She'd feared this moment, the pull to give more than she could. She took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "Thomas, I love Ava, and I'm committed to our plan. But I can't take on more days. I'm already stretching myself. Have you looked into daycare centers? Some of them are wonderful." Thomas's jaw clenched, and for a moment, Eleanor braced for an argument. But then he sighed, his shoulders slumping. "I know you're doing a lot, Mom. It's just hard. We want the best for Ava, and you're the best." The compliment warmed her, but it also underscored the pressure she'd been feeling. "I want the best for her too," she said gently. "But I can't be the only answer. You and Lily are amazing parents. You'll find a way, and I'll help however I can within our agreement." Thomas nodded, his expression a mix of resignation and respect. "Okay, we'll figure it out." He paused, then added, "I'm proud of you, Mom, for standing up for yourself. I didn't get it at first, but I'm starting to." The words were a balm, soothing the ache of their earlier tensions. Eleanor smiled, reaching for his hand. "Thank you, Thomas. That means more than you know." As spring turned to summer, Eleanor found a rhythm that felt sustainable. She cherished her days with Ava, watching the baby's first smiles and coos. But she also guarded her own time fiercely, painting in the evenings and meeting Margaret for walks. She began to see her role not as a sacrifice, but as a gift, one she could give freely because it was on her terms. One afternoon, while Ava napped, Eleanor sat at her easel, working on a painting of her garden, the tulips vibrant against the green. She thought of how far she'd come, from the shock of Thomas's request to this moment of balance. She wasn't just a grandmother. She was Eleanor Grayson, artist, friend, mother, and now, a woman who knew her own worth. Summer brought a new warmth to Eleanor's life, both literal and figurative. Ava was growing fast, her giggles filling the house on the days Eleanor cared for her. The routine was still demanding, but Eleanor had learned to pace herself, leaning on small efficiencies like pre-made bottles and a strict nap schedule. She'd also found joy in the little moments reading bored books to Ava, watching her tiny hands grasp at the air, sketching her sleeping form in quick, tender lines. Thomas and Lily, meanwhile, were navigating their own challenges. They'd found a part-time sitter, a kind young woman named Sarah, who took Ava 2 days a week. The arrangement wasn't perfect. Sarah's availability was limited, and daycare costs were higher than they'd hoped, but they were making it work. Eleanor noticed a change in Thomas, a growing acceptance of her boundaries. He called less often to check in, trusting her to manage her days with Ava. And when they talked, he asked about her painting, her friends, her life. One sunny afternoon, Eleanor took Ava to the park, pushing the stroller along a shaded path. The air smelled of cut grass and blooming jasmine, and Ava babbled happily, her eyes wide with curiosity. Eleanor sat on a bench, watching families around her, parents chasing toddlers, grandparents pushing swings. She felt a kinship with them, but also a quiet pride in how she'd carved out her own path. She wasn't just a caregiver. She was a grandmother who chose her role deliberately. That evening, Lily came to pick up Ava, looking tired but content. "You're amazing with her, Eleanor," she said, watching Ava sleep in her car seat. "I don't know how we do this without you." Eleanor smiled, her heart full. "I love every minute with her, but I'm glad we found a balance. It's good for all of us." Lily nodded, her eyes softening. "I'm sorry if we put too much on you at first. We were so caught up in the baby and our jobs, we didn't think about what it meant for you." The apology caught Eleanor off guard, stirring a mix of gratitude and relief. "Thank you, Lily. It's been a learning curve for all of us, but we're figuring it out together." As the months passed, Eleanor's confidence grew. She started showing her paintings at a local gallery, a small but thrilling step. One piece, a portrait of Ava asleep in her crib, sold within days. And the buyer, a young mother, told Eleanor it captured the quiet magic of new life. The praise felt like a validation, not just of her art, but of her choice to hold space for herself. Thomas, too, was changing. He began to share more about his own struggles, long hours at work, the pressure to provide, the fear of not being enough for Ava. One evening, over coffee at Eleanor's kitchen table, he admitted, "I used to think you'd just step in, like you always did when I was a kid. But I get it now. Mom, you've got your own life, and you deserve it." Eleanor's eyes stung with tears. "I'll always be here for you and Ava," she said. "But I'm glad you see me as more than just mom or grandma. I'm still figuring out who I am, too." Their bond deepened, rooted in a new mutual respect. Eleanor felt lighter, as if the weight of expectation had lifted. She began to dream bigger, maybe a solo art show, maybe a trip to Paris, a place George had always promised they'd visit. For the first time, she believed she could be both a devoted grandmother and a woman chasing her own passions. One crisp fall day, Eleanor hosted a small family gathering to celebrate Ava's 6-month milestone. The living room was filled with laughter, the smell of apple pie, and the soft hum of love. Thomas and Lily brought photos of Ava's recent adventures, and Margaret stopped by with a handmade rattle. As Eleanor watched Ava crawl across the floor, her heart swelled with gratitude, not just for the baby, but for the life she was building around her. Later, as she cleaned up, Eleanor found herself humming an old tune, one she'd sung to Thomas as a child. She thought of how far they'd come, from tension and misunderstanding to a partnership that honored everyone's needs. She wasn't perfect, and neither were they, but they were trying, and that was enough. By the time Ava turned 1, Eleanor's life felt like a tapestry woven with threads of love, art, and hard-won boundaries. Her days with Ava were a joy, filled with first words and wobbly steps. But they no longer defined her. She'd started teaching a painting class at the community center, sharing her passion with others, and her work was gaining notice in the local art scene. She felt alive, as if she'd rediscovered a part of herself she'd thought was lost forever. Thomas and Lily had settled into their roles as parents, their confidence growing with each milestone. They'd found a reliable daycare for the days Eleanor wasn't available, and though it stretched their budget, they made it work. Thomas, in particular, had become more attuned to Eleanor's needs, often asking about her latest painting or her plans for the weekend. Their relationship, once strained by unspoken expectations, had grown stronger, built on honesty and mutual respect. One evening, as Eleanor rocked Ava to sleep, she reflected on the journey since Thomas's announcement. She'd been terrified then, caught between her love for her family and her fear of losing herself. But by setting boundaries, she'd found a way to give without giving everything. She'd learned to say no without guilt, to say yes with intention. Ava's laughter, her tiny hand in Eleanor's, was a gift, but so was the quiet of her own mornings, the feel of a paintbrush in her hand, the freedom to be Eleanor. At Ava's first birthday party, the backyard was alive with color balloons, streamers, and a cake topped with a single candle. Eleanor watched as Thomas and Lily helped Ava blow it out, their faces glowing with pride. She felt a pang of nostalgia for Thomas's own first birthday, but also a deep contentment. She'd been there for him, and now she was here for Ava, but she was also here for herself. As the party wound down, Thomas pulled Eleanor aside. "Mom, I just want to say thank you for everything, for being there for Ava, for being you. I didn't get it at first, but I'm so glad you stood up for what you needed. It's made us all better." Eleanor's throat tightened, and she hugged him fiercely. "I'm glad too," she whispered. "I love you, Thomas. And I love this life we're building together." That night, alone in her armchair, Eleanor opened her sketchbook to a new page. She began to draw a scene of the party, Ava's tiny hand reaching for the cake, Thomas and Lily laughing, herself in the background, smiling with a quiet strength. It was a portrait of family, of love, of balance. As she sketched, she thought of George, of how proud he'd be, not just of their son, but of her. She'd found a way to honor both her family and her dreams, to live fully in both worlds. The next morning, Eleanor woke to the sound of birds outside her window. She brewed her tea, sat by her easel, and began to paint. The canvas was blank, full of possibility, just like her life. She didn't know what the future held. Ava would grow. New challenges would come, and her art would evolve, but she knew she was ready. She'd learned to love fiercely, to give generously, and to hold space for herself. And that, she thought, was the greatest gift of all.